The end of the war saw many great challenges for the world, Lido Island especially. The island had been ravaged by war, burned farms, destroyed cities, economical damage. It was very widespread and very severe. It took a long time for things to get back on track, and even longer for life to return fully to normal. After the war, there was renewed interest in nationalizing the railways of Britain. If you remember from the last video, Lido Island was vehemently against anything to do with the British government getting involved with the railways. Stralen's original intention was to have his second eldest son Jamie run the railway, but BR had other ideas. Jamie was young and rather inexperienced, meanwhile they had several men who had worked on the railway for years. On paper it was a good idea, in practice, well, some problems cropped up, some very serious problems. Anyone who knows anything about BR would know that the scheme had so many problems. For one, BR's line of steam engines. They were built to peak efficiency and could have been running through to the 1980s, but all they were was a bridge for the line of diesels that when they were rolled out onto the network had some very serious problems. Some had failed to start, some stalled out on the main line, none of which helped when air and road travel began to grow in popularity. Part of BR's modernization plan was to add electricity to the rails, but this was only going to be focused on a couple of lines on the mainland, and any schemes to add them to Lido Island were tossed, costing the company several thousands of pounds for already pre-ordered materials. Another aspect was the update to the network, which really only dressed the lines up with new signals and didn't eliminate any of the already existing problems. Another issue was the very large and numerous marshalling yards that cropped up all over the network. In theory, they would have been able to store large amounts of BR stock efficiently. BR didn't factor in the growing trend of container shipping, which made the various private-owned wagons obsolete. Of course, all these problems and more were compounded by the railway's new controller, Carl Blakely, who was unfortunately not very suited to his position in the slightest. Not all the steam engines were withdrawn and scrapped immediately. Some, believe it or not, were upgraded to the BR standard and even kept their own liveries, but not very many of them. The ones who were proved to be incredibly efficient, powerful, and didn't really need that much maintenance to them. Some engines were okay with the livery change, others were not. I mean, these were coats of paint they had had all their lives, and then suddenly they have to change it for a livery of a company that really was not keeping their best interests at heart. How many of them were going to be scrapped? How many of them were going to be withdrawn from service? Diesel engines were rolling out in droves, so they didn't really see the point. As some might have guessed, the diesels and the steam engines clashed. The diesels thought they were quite superior to the steam engines, while the steam engines didn't like the idea of being frozen out of the network. There are several reports of diesels making fun of the steam engines, saying that they would be scrapped. Unfortunately, this would end up to be true, as many steam engines were withdrawn in favor of diesel power. In spite of all the troubles that the diesels caused, BR still wanted to completely dieselize Lido Island. Jamie Stralen, however, firmly objected to it after he became the new director following Carl Blakely's dismissal. After much debate and some back and forth trading, BR decided to only keep one line of Lido Island for diesels. This would be called the Kings Harbor branch. This small little branch ran from the coastal town of Kings Harbor and up to the town of Holbeck. An interesting tidbit about this line is that it was formerly a narrow gauge line. This was once the former Marlton and Holbeck line, a small railway that went bankrupt after World War II. BR had decided to rip up the old rails and replace them with brand new ones while sending an entire fleet of diesels to run the branch. Though the branch did well for a time, it suffered many problems, the biggest one being the teething troubles with the diesels. In spite of all the problems and shakeups that happened on the railway, the Kings Harbor branch still exists today. Jamie had a very bad smoking problem very early on in life. Then again, everyone smoked back then. Unfortunately, he developed lung cancer later in his life. I still remember the day he told me. It was rather distressing, if I'm being honest. In spite of what the doctors did, Jamie Strallen unfortunately passed away in 1982. Control of the railway then had to go to his second in command, Bolton Burns. After Jamie Strallen was buried, Bolton Burns immediately set to work to try and get Lido Island away from British Railways once and for all. Luckily, thanks to public disapproval of British Railways, not to mention their very low ratings, there was a very strong case to make that Lido Island should be once again an independent rail system. In the end, BR agreed to allow Lido Island to be its own company once again. However, that also included the King's Harbor branch. It was divested from the Lido Island Railway very quickly after the deal was struck. This meant the King Harbor Diesel Railway could no longer rely on government support for help, and since the Lido Island Railway took up a majority of the island, this meant the company's prospects were very grim. The new director, Alan Greer, had attempted to negotiate with Burns, hoping that they could find some middle ground. Unfortunately, due to the company's bad reputation, not to mention the fact that Greer himself had been in trouble before with the railway board, Burns was very unwilling to negotiate. Even though the negotiations failed, the King's Harbor branch is still around today and still very functional. And speaking of today, thanks to the success of the Thomas the Tank Engine series, Lido Island became very popular, with many people wanting to see the engines and asking them if they had ever been to the island of Sodor. Many engines had been to the island of Sodor, but many more had their own tales to tell. Many of which we'll talk about soon, but that will have to wait until next time.